to a human school where everyone was the same.
So in the last video I made a point of talking about the change in types of cartoons that air now compared to what used to air. But that did get me thinking about something. What happened to the slice of life genre of cartoons? Well, that's what I'm here to talk about. Hello everyone and welcome to the Void Theater. As always, I'm your host Alexander, and having spent more than a healthy amount of time watching, theorizing, and researching cartoons, you tend to notice the weird trends that networks go through. The thing is that most of the time you can usually point out why they stopped doing certain things. Whether it's from a lack of attention from the audience, or the fact that the general concept just didn't pan out the way they wanted it to, there's usually some visible reason for things to just stop. That is, of course, except for the disappearance of the slice of life genre of cartoons. Now before we get too into this, I should clarify something. When I'm talking about slice of life, I mean shows that maintain it throughout the entirety of that show's run. So no, shows like Gravity Falls, or Adventure Time, or Steven Universe don't count towards this. Those are shows that started as slice of life, quickly moved into story-driven plots, and all but erased the theme of general day-to-day activities. So we're mainly going to be going over the shows like Fairly Odd Parents, Chowder, Flapjack, and the others. Basically the shows that once dominated the networks, but have since been retired or flat out ignored over time. So let's try to figure out why that happened. Going over where the slice of life genre hit its peak, try to figure out why they became so popular in the first place, and most importantly, what influenced the drastic change over the years that caused them to fall out of popularity, and whether or not they can make a return. And as always, if you enjoy the video, be sure to like and subscribe for more content. But without any further ado, we can begin. So let's raise the curtain, put this genre on stage, and see how it lost its touch. Alright, so let's start with that first question. When did the slice of life genre really take off and hit its peak? And that's a bit complicated because the slice of life genre has been around for decades in animation. Outside of random misadventure cartoons from places like Hanna-Barbera, it's arguably one of the staples of the animation industry. For as long as animation has been around, slice of life cartoons have followed, and it's easy to see why. They're relatively cheaper to produce than action-oriented animation that can sometimes require more money for more detailed and extensive fight scenes. They require far less of a writing staff compared to more story-driven counterparts, which is also probably why they hit their peak in the early 2000s, which, if you weren't around for that time, was known for two things. Cartoons were still seen as something almost exclusively for children, with some rare exceptions, and thus many networks felt they didn't have to try as hard. And two, was that it was essentially a dead zone for most of the major cartoon channels. Now again, I've talked about the issues Cartoon Network has faced at this time, but what I tend to skip over is how the other channels were handling themselves. Which was, to be blunt, not well. In Nick's case, they had just turned down the opportunity of hosting Adventure Time for Fanboy and Chum Chum, and while they did have a heavyweight in the form of cartoon legend Butch Hartman, his more recent shows like Tough Puppy were nowhere near the level of fame that Fairly Odd Parents and Danny Phantom had achieved. Unless you were a furry, in which case this was probably an amazing time for you. And even ignoring that failure, most of the other shows coming out around that time weren't exactly massive hits either. Planet Sheen was such a massive disappointment that it was essentially buried by the third season. Now that's not to say that nothing was being made around this time that was noteworthy. Nick had just started and finished Avatar in this time period, and that's arguably one of the most iconic shows ever created. But the fact remains is that because of this weird dead gap in animation programming, the channels themselves had become perfect breeding grounds for slice of life shows, many of which were better left forgotten. Let's just let that one sit there for a minute. But for a few select others, they ended up becoming iconic in their own way. Keep in mind that with how I'm defining slice of life in this video, total drama does fall into that category, and it's usually heralded as one of the saviors of Cartoon Network. And in the case of Nick and Disney, shows like My Life as a Teenage Robot, El Tigre, and American Dragon Jake Long, while not nearly as popular, still would be considered cult classics. But again, the point still remains that when talking about the peak of this genre, then the early 2000s is really the place to notice where it started to hit its stride. But that does bring us to the next big question. If these shows were so prevalent in the early 2000s, then why did they just randomly drop in popularity? And while there are more than a few answers to go over, let's just address the biggest one, which is that the main cause was genuinely just viewer fatigue of this genre. Now, like I just said, I'm in no way denying the fact that a decent chunk of these shows kept viewership going. But what I am saying is that unlike story-driven or action shows, the genre only has one real path to take, and that handicaps it greatly. Take for instance Fresh TV, the makers of Total Drama. which again is actually a standout of the style, and then created 16, which also ended up becoming one of the more famous shows on Cartoon Network. But on the other hand, the show Stoked exists, which is somehow not a spin-off of 16, but instead a completely separate show that also has the vibe and the characterizations of the show that came before it. And that's what I mean by fatigue. It's not that Stoked was a bad show. I mean, it was forgettable, but it wasn't bad. But the public perception of these types of shows had already changed. And again, that was in no small part because of the recent slice of life shows that had just come out and soured everyone on the genre with their mediocrity. But that's also ignoring the bigger issue, which is that aside from the audience growing tired of this, it's painfully apparent that the higher-ups were as well. I talked about in my last video, but this was around a time that the networks were extremely desperate to find some way to maintain audience presence and attention, which led to the extreme increase in crossovers, or as I just learned is a recent thing, thank you commenter, cross-through events. But the thing is, those weren't working. But you know what was? The birth of heavy story-driven shows like Avatar. And setting that aside for a moment, I realize I talk a lot about Adventure Time. I know I do, and for good reason. I've said before that the impact that Adventure Time had on animation can't ever be fully understood. That being said, take everything I've ever said about Adventure Time and double it for Avatar. Because as impactful as Adventure Time is, the truth is that Avatar was doing it first and on a much greater scale. This is a show that fundamentally changed how a lot of people saw cartoons. And for a lot of viewers, they didn't want to go back to the genre that offered no real reason to keep watching. And companies took notice of that. It's why almost 20 years later, Viacom has continued to milk the franchise for every bit it can get. And if we're being honest, it's worked wonders for them. Just a reminder that the company gave Avatar their own separate studio, is currently producing a live Netflix adaptation, and 3 separate movies. And that was all announced in the same year. The only slice of life show that's ever come close to that level of success was SpongeBob. And even then, that show had to run for nearly 2 decades to get its 3 movies. So you can see the change that's happened over the years, and more importantly, that the audience's response to that change has been nothing but positive. And that actually brings us to the final major question. With all the ups and downs this genre has had, is it possible for the slice of life to return to the same popularity it used to have? And the answer is oddly complicated. Because while yes, slice of life shows have fallen out of favor, it's not as if they're completely gone. Like I said, there are still some prominent ones like Craig of the Creek, The Loud House, and even SpongeBob. All these shows are still very much active, and in the case of the first 2 have even had TV specials, movies, and in the case of The Loud House, multiple spin-offs and even live-action productions made for them. But again, for them it seems less like a sign of success, and more like the network just trying to fill out a schedule. Take The Loud House for instance, which actually seems to be a textbook case of that issue, considering that since the rightful firing of the series creators, many fans seem to agree that the show has been going downhill, and there is some evidence to back that up. Remember that movie I talked about? Well, while it did draw in an audience, it still ended up performing far worse than what Nick was hoping for, sitting at just a 6.1 out of 10 on IMDb. And as for Craig of the Creek, while popular, it is still struggling behind its predecessors in terms of engagement. And just to make clear what I mean by this, let me ask you a question. Were you aware there was an 8-part Craig of the Creek special that aired for damn near an entire week on the channel? Yeah, it was called The Heart of the Forest Saga. You wanna know how I found out about it? Because HBO Max updated the title card when you log in to see it. But that's what I mean when I say that the genre isn't completely dead. These shows still exist in some form or another, but their popularity, at least in the younger demographics, has greatly diminished. But on the other hand, it's clear that the genre has shifted hard into the adult animated section, with shows like American Dad, Family Guy, Rick and Morty, Futurama, and most recently Dan Harmon's other show. Wow, I have no idea how to pronounce that, and I'm going to take a shot at that. But the point still remains is that all these shows are slice of life sitcoms and have each found their own distinct audiences. So the question then changes from, can the genre make a comeback, to can the genre recapture a younger audience? And I think the answer to that is no. The truth is that the slice of life's time with the younger demographic has already come and gone. And admittedly, it lasted a long time, but that moment is gone now, and it's been replaced by a desire for more plot-heavy shows. And whether that's from the audience having seen enough of them, corporate deciding that investing in them isn't worth it, or the animators, writers, and artists deciding that they want to do something more meaningful, the point still remains that while the slice of life genre will never fully die off, it has expired a fair bit, at least for the younger audience. And with the current slew of shows coming out in the next couple of years, I can't imagine that that's going to change anytime soon. Which honestly might be for the best, because for every Courage the Cowardly Dog, Ed, and Eddie, and Billy and Mandy, there's always a million Squirrel Boys. Man, fuck that show. But with that, we come to the curtain call on the downfall of the slice of life genre. You know, when it comes to a topic like this, I typically have some lingering thoughts on whether or not the change was good or bad. But here, despite all my complaining about it, I can't really tell because it's all subjective. So, I'll leave it to you with our closing thought of the video. Do you believe that the change in genres for animation was a good one? And if not, do you want the slice of life genre to have more prominence again? Leave a comment down below letting me know what you think, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content. But until next time, as always, I've been your host Alexander, and I hope to see you back in my theater.